In the year 1825, long after the great ships were meant to have ceased their cruel commerce, history etched a name into its shadowed ledgers, a name tied not to the fields of cotton or the heat of the forge, but to the first breath of life. This is the account of Ruthann Kinsey, a woman whose role in the machinery of the slave trade was among its most chilling, a deliverer of infants straight from the womb into the waiting holds of slave ships. Her story is a testament to the quiet, almost invisible horrors that underpinned a monstrous economy, a reminder that the deepest darkness is often found not in the open field of battle, but in the fire-lit stillness of a birthing room. If you find yourself drawn to the whispers of history's most unsettling chapters, and this is your first time crossing our threshold, consider subscribing to our archive. Here, we unseal the records that time has tried to forget and ensure no voice is ever truly lost to the silence. To comprehend the nature of the woman known as Ruthann, one must first be willing to breathe the air of her time, an atmosphere thick with the competing scents of salt spray and industrial smoke, of progress and profound human suffering. The year 1825 was a period of jarring contradiction in the burgeoning United States. The international slave trade had been formally abolished by federal law for nearly 2 decades, an act of legislative morality that was, in practice, little more than a whisper against a hurricane. The law forbade the importation of human beings for the purpose of enslavement, but it did nothing to dismantle the institution itself. Instead, it turned the domestic slave trade into a ravenous, self-sustaining engine. The demand for labor in the expanding cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South was insatiable, and this demand created a market where human life was cataloged with the same dispassionate arithmetic as barrels of molasses or bolts of cloth. This was the world that created a niche for a woman like Ruthann, a world where the law had sealed one door only to throw open 100 more in the darkened corridors of the nation's soul. The coastal cities of this era were the pulsing veins of this trade. They were places of immense energy and stark divides. Along the wharves, the masts of merchant vessels stood like a skeletal forest against skies often gray with coal soot and ocean mist. The sounds were a cacophony of ambition and despair. The rhythmic thud of hammers from the shipyards, the shouts of foremen and sailors in a dozen languages, the creak of cranes lifting cargo from the docks, all mingled with a lower, more persistent hum, the sound of the trade in human lives. It was in the clink of shackles being loaded onto wagons in the pre-dawn quiet, in the low murmur of conversations in taverns, where captains and traders negotiated the value of a human soul over mugs of ale, and in the profound, heart-wrenching silence that fell over the auction blocks when a family was torn asunder. The air itself seemed heavy, saturated with the unwritten histories of countless individuals whose names were lost to the ledgers that recorded only their price, their age, and their perceived physical strength. It was a world built on a foundation of meticulously documented inhumanity, a society that had perfected the art of looking away. This brutal economy had its own terrible logic. It was forward-thinking in the most perverse sense. Plantation owners and investors were not merely purchasing labor for the current season. They were acquiring assets for generations to come. A healthy adult male or female was a valuable commodity, but an infant, a newborn, represented something more. An infant was a long-term investment, a blank slate upon which a lifetime of servitude could be written, a human being who could be molded from their very first breath to know no other reality than bondage. This commodification of the future created a specific and chilling demand for the youngest of victims. They were less likely to carry the memories of freedom, less prone to the kind of rebellion that flickered in the eyes of those who had known another life. They were, in the cold calculus of the slavers, a more stable and enduring form of property. The transport of infants, while perilous, was seen by some traders as a grim necessity, a way to replenish the workforce and ensure the continuity of a system that consumed human lives as fuel. Ship logs from this period, though often sanitized, sometimes contain entries that speak to this reality in coded, sterile language. They list cargo of indeterminable age, or note the presence of nursing mothers whose children were not always recorded by name, but merely as an extension of their mother's value. It was a system that had found a way to monetize the sacred bond between a mother and her child, turning the act of birth into the first step of a journey into captivity. Into this world walked Ruthann Kinsey. She was not a woman of wealth or high station. She did not own the ships or the plantations. Her name appeared on no grand ledgers of commerce. She was, to all outward appearances, a fixture of the community's underbelly, a woman whose skills were sought out in the desperate hours of night, in the cramped and poorly lit quarters, where the enslaved and the impoverished brought new life into the world. She was a midwife. In the early 19th century, midwifery was a craft learned through apprenticeship and experience, a domain of women who understood the mysteries of childbirth in a way that the formally trained male physicians of the era often did not. Midwives were figures of immense importance and, at times, deep suspicion. They held the power of life and death in their hands. They were privy to the most intimate moments of a family's existence, the pain and the terror, and the ultimate miracle of birth. Ruthann had built a reputation for herself in the warrens of the city. She was known to be discreet, to ask few questions, and to possess a steady hand in even the most difficult of deliveries. There was a humanizing detail remembered about her, a small crack in the monolithic facade of her later infamy. It was said that she had a peculiar talent for soothing colicky babies, that she knew of an herbal tea, a mixture of fennel and chamomile, that could quiet the most incessant cries. Mothers, in those first desperate weeks, would whisper their gratitude, telling others that Ruthann had a gentle touch, a strange gift for bringing peace to a household tormented by a newborn's wails. This reputation was her shield. It allowed her to move through the city with a purpose that few questioned. She carried a worn leather bag filled with the tools of her trade, clean linens, sharp scissors, bundles of dried herbs, and tinctures in small glass bottles. She was a familiar sight, a solitary woman walking the cobblestone streets at odd hours, her face often shadowed by a heavy bonnet. But those who paid closer attention might have noticed other, less commonplace details. They might have observed that her services were most often required in the communities of the enslaved and the free black population living perilously close to the wharves. They might have noted that her visits often coincided with the arrival or imminent departure of certain ships, vessels whose captains had reputations for running illicit cargo, for dealing in the human contraband that the law had officially renounced. The sounds of the harbor were the constant backdrop to her work. The tolling of a ship's bell, the rhythmic chants of sailors hoisting an anchor, the mournful cry of a foghorn on a misty morning, these were the sounds that permeated the walls of the rooms where she delivered new life. For most, these were simply the noises of a bustling port. For the mothers under Ruthann's care, they would become a terrifying soundtrack to loss, the auditory heralds of a nightmare from which they would never awaken. Her role, at this stage, was a matter of whispers, of fragmented stories shared in hushed tones between women who had reason to fear her. The full, monstrous truth of her work had not yet coalesced into a public accusation. Instead, there was a creeping dread, a pattern that was beginning to emerge, too consistent to be mere coincidence. A healthy baby would be born, its first cries a sound of vibrant life in a cramped, oppressive room. Ruthann would perform her duties with practiced efficiency, swaddling the infant, murmuring words of reassurance to the exhausted mother, She would often advise that the mother needed undisturbed rest, that it was best for the baby to be taken into another room for a time, to be kept warm by the fire, to be allowed to sleep. And then, in the gray hours before dawn, the baby would be gone. The explanations were always plausible, always delivered with a somber, unshakable calm. The child had been born too weak, its lungs had failed, it had been taken by a sudden fever in the night. In a time when infant mortality was tragically high, these explanations were, on the surface, believable. Death was a constant and familiar visitor in these communities, but the stories persisted. A mother would swear she had heard her baby cry out just moments before being told the child was gone. Another would remember the distinct smell of sea salt and tar on Ruthann's cloak when she returned to the room, empty-handed. Rumors began to circulate, dark and fragmented tales of a small, swaddled bundle being passed to a waiting man in a darkened alleyway that led directly to the docks. A drayman, making an early morning delivery, once claimed to have seen Ruthann speaking with the first mate of a slaver ship, a man known for his brutality and his involvement in the illegal trade. The drayman said he saw her accept a small, heavy purse, its contents clinking with the sound of coins. He reported that she had looked up then, her eyes meeting his in the dim light, and her expression was not one of a grieving midwife, but of a merchant who had just concluded a transaction. The drayman, fearing for his own safety, later recanted his story, claiming the poor light had deceived him. But the seed of the story had been planted, and it began to grow in the fertile soil of the community's fear. The core question began to form in the minds of those who had witnessed her work, a question that was too terrifying to ask aloud. Who was this woman who seemed to trail death in her wake, but only for the newly born? Who was this healer whose presence brought not life, but a strange and sudden emptiness? The name of Ruthann Kinsey was becoming inextricably tied to the cries of newborns and to the chilling silence that followed. The title of midwife, a name meant to signify the bringing of life, was beginning to curdle, to become synonymous with something else entirely, something that smelled of the deep, cold water of the ocean and the inescapable confines of a ship's hold. Her purpose was a shadowy terror, hinted at in the disappearance of infants, in the cold finality of her explanations, and in the persistent, undeniable proximity of her work to the ships that sailed on the morning tide, their hulls filled with a silent, human cargo. To understand her, we must first understand the world she lived in, a world that had created a market for the very lives she was meant to protect. The machinery that demanded the services of a woman like Ruthann Kinsey was not born of spontaneous cruelty, but was rather the meticulously constructed engine of a national economy. To grasp the chilling logic that commodified a newborn infant, one must look past the individual acts of horror and into the very architecture of the American slave system in the 1820s. It was a system that had evolved, by necessity, into a closed, self-perpetuating market. The Federal Act of 1807, which outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, did not sever the institution's arteries. Instead, it cauterized the external wound, forcing the body to feed upon itself. With the supply of human beings from Africa officially cut off, the domestic trade swelled to monstrous proportions, creating a vast and brutal internal market that was, in many ways, more insidious than the one it replaced. The value of an enslaved person already within the nation's borders skyrocketed. And with this surge in value came a shift in focus, a new and terrible form of human agriculture. The states of the Upper South, places like Virginia and Maryland, where the tobacco economy was waning, found a new and profitable export. They became the breeding grounds for the insatiable cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South. The language of animal husbandry was openly applied to human beings. Plantation owners spoke of their stock and calculated the value of a fertile woman not just for her labor, but for her capacity to produce more laborers. This was codified in the legal principle of partus sequitur ventrum, a cold Latin phrase inherited from Roman law which dictated that the status of a child followed that of the mother. A child born to an enslaved woman was, by law, the property of her owner from the moment of their first breath. This legal framework was the bedrock upon which the entire domestic slave trade was built. It transformed the womb into a site of production, and birth into an act of inventory. A newborn was not a child. It was an asset, a unit of future labor, an entry in a ledger. The system was designed to strip the humanity from its victims, to reduce them to a set of quantifiable traits that could be assessed, valued, and sold. The economic normalization of this horror was absolute. Enslaved individuals were used as collateral for loans, their bodies securing the mortgages on the very plantations where they toiled. Insurance policies were taken out on their lives, not as a recognition of their humanity, but as a means of protecting a financial investment against loss. In the marketplaces of cities like Charleston and New Orleans, auction blocks stood as permanent fixtures of the urban landscape. Here, human beings were displayed, inspected, and sold with the same dispassionate professionalism as livestock. Their teeth were checked, their muscles prodded, their backs examined for the scars that told a story of past resistance and punishment. And amidst the sales of strong men and skilled women, there was a quieter, but no less significant, trade in the very young. Infants and small children were often sold alongside their mothers, listed on auction notices as an enhancement, a bonus that increased the mother's price. A healthy woman with issue, as the ledgers often phrased it, was a premium asset. This system created the specific and unnatural demand for infants. A slave trader, a man whose entire existence was predicated on calculating the long-term value of human life, saw a newborn not with sentiment, but with a cold, financial eye. An adult brought from Africa in the days before abolition of the trade required a period of seasoning, a brutal process of acclimation to a new climate, new diseases, and a new life of forced labor, a process which a significant number of people did not survive. Even a domestically traded adult, torn from their home and family, carried with them memories of a different life, a spark of defiance that might need to be brutally extinguished. An infant, however, was a different proposition entirely. A baby taken at birth could be raised within the system, their entire worldview shaped by the reality of bondage. They would know no other world, no other family, than the one designated by their owner. The breaking of their spirit, a necessary act in the eyes of the slave owner, would not be a violent confrontation, but a slow, daily process of indoctrination from their first moments of consciousness. This made them, in the perverse logic of the trade, a more reliable, more stable, and ultimately more profitable long-term investment. The documents of this era are a testament to this calculated dehumanization. They are not filled with the language of overt hatred, but with something far more chilling: the sterile, passionless language of commerce. A ship's manifest from a coastal trader moving its human cargo from Norfolk to New Orleans would list its passengers by first name, age, and skill. But infants were often not afforded even that small dignity. They might be recorded simply as infant, unnamed, or as a check mark in a column next to their mother's name. In the account books of a plantation, the birth of a child to an enslaved woman would be noted in the same ledger as the birth of a calf, recorded as an increase in the plantation's overall stock. These were not the records of monsters who reveled in their cruelty. They were the records of businessmen, of investors, of a society that had so thoroughly integrated this inhumanity into its economic fabric that it had become unremarkable, a simple matter of accounting. It was this normalization that allowed a society to not only tolerate the trafficking of babies, but to create a specific economic niche for it. This is the world that provided the context for Ruthann Kinsey's work. She was not an architect of this system, but one of its most specialized and hidden functionaries. She was the first link in a supply chain that began in the quiet of a birthing room and ended in the brutal sun of a cotton field hundreds of miles away. Her connection to the ships was a matter of grim logistics. The captains of the smaller coastal vessels, the sloops and schooners that plied the waters between the port cities, were often independent operators, willing to transport any cargo that turned a profit. They dealt in lumber, in grain, in textiles, and in human beings. For them, an infant was a small, easily concealed piece of cargo, one that required minimal space and sustenance. A deal with a woman like Ruthann was a simple, off-the-books transaction, a quiet exchange in a waterfront tavern, a handful of coins passed in a dark alley, was all that was required. She provided a direct source, bypassing the more public and scrutinized channels of the auction house. She could acquire the product at its freshest, before any bond could form, before a name was even given. Her role as a midwife gave her unparalleled access. She was invited into the most vulnerable moments in a woman's life, a time of immense pain and trust. She operated under the perfect cover, her presence in the slave quarters, or the impoverished tenements near the docks, being entirely expected. The mothers she attended were often isolated, without the protection of a strong family or community network. They were the most marginalized members of a marginalized population, their voices easily silenced, their stories easily dismissed. When a baby disappeared under Ruthann's care, there was little recourse. The word of an enslaved woman against a woman who, however grimly, provided a necessary service, was no contest at all. She was a predator who had found her unique and terrible hunting ground. The genius of her cruelty was its simplicity. She did not need to orchestrate elaborate kidnappings. She merely had to wait for life to present itself, and then, under the guise of care, divert it into the waiting channels of the slave economy. The sounds of the harbor, the creaking of the ships and the calls of the gulls, were not just background noise to her work. They were the sounds of her marketplace, the audible proof of the demand she was so uniquely positioned to supply. She was the answer to a question the market was asking, a question that most of polite society refused to acknowledge was even being posed. But how did one woman, a healer, a bringer of life, become this vital, monstrous link between the sacred act of childbirth and the profane reality of captivity? Ruthann Kinsey's reputation was a meticulously crafted edifice, built upon a foundation of genuine skill and the desperate needs of the communities she served. In the cramped, airless cabins of the enslaved and the damp basement dwellings of the city's free but impoverished black population, childbirth was a crucible of terror. It was a private war waged against infection, exhaustion, and the ever-present specter of death. Formal medicine was a luxury reserved for the white and the wealthy, its practitioners often holding a dangerous disdain for the very people Ruthann attended. She, by contrast, arrived without judgment. She brought with her a sense of calm authority, her presence suggesting a bulwark against the chaos of labor. She knew the ancient remedies, the ways to turn a breech baby, the specific herbs to brew to staunch a hemorrhage or ease the pain of afterbirth. Women who had survived a delivery under her care would speak of her competence in hushed, grateful tones. They would tell others that her hands, though rough and calloused, moved with a practiced certainty, that she knew how to read the signs of distress before they became a crisis. This was the public face of her work, the mask of the healer that allowed her to move through these communities not as a threat, but as a grim necessity. Her arrival at a birthing was a study in quiet efficiency. She would enter a room, often lit by a single sputtering tallow candle that cast long, dancing shadows on the rough-planked walls, and her first act would be to take stock. Her gaze would sweep over the space, noting the cleanliness of the linens, the availability of fresh water, the disposition of the laboring mother. There was an almost ritualistic quality to her preparations. She would untie her bonnet, its dark fabric seeming to absorb the meager light, and lay it carefully aside. From her worn leather bag, she would produce her implements, not with a flourish, but with a series of deliberate, economical movements. A bar of harsh lye soap for washing her hands, a roll of clean, homespun cotton, a small, sharp knife for cutting the cord, its blade honed to a razor's edge. Her silence was often her most powerful tool. In a room thick with fear and the agonized cries of labor, her quiet focus could feel like an anchor. She rarely offered words of comfort, but her methodical actions seemed to promise an outcome, a resolution to the pain. She was there to do a job, and this dispassionate professionalism was, in its own way, a source of reassurance for women who had been treated their entire lives as little more than laboring animals. They mistook her detachment for strength. The turning point, the moment the healer's mask would slip to reveal the monster beneath, always came after the child's first cry. This sound, which should have signaled a release of tension and the beginning of a new life, was, for Ruthann, merely a cue. It was the signal that her true work was about to begin. An account from a woman named Seraphina, a story passed down through generations until it was little more than a whisper of a ghost story, provides the clearest window into the method. Seraphina was young, and this was her first child. The labor had been long and difficult, lasting for more than a day and a night. Ruthann had been with her the entire time, a silent, watchful presence. When the baby, a boy, was finally born, healthy and strong, Seraphina had wept with a relief so profound it left her breathless. She remembered the feel of his small, warm body against her skin, the surprising strength of his grip on her finger. She remembered the smell of him, a mixture of blood and birth and life, a scent she knew she would never forget. Ruthann had allowed this moment to last for only a few minutes. She had then taken the child, her movements still gentle, still professional. She had told Seraphina that the baby was growing cold and needed to be properly swaddled and placed near the hearth. She had told the exhausted mother that the most important thing now was for her to rest, to sleep, to regain her strength. Her voice was low and even, the tone of a trusted caregiver offering sound advice. Seraphina, weak and delirious with pain and joy, had not argued. She had watched as Ruthann wrapped her son in a thick woolen cloth, her hands moving with a practiced swiftness that seemed almost like a sleight of hand. The bundle was neat and tight. Ruthann had then carried the child from the small room, promising to return shortly to check on the new mother. Seraphina had closed her eyes. The sounds of the nearby harbor, the distant clanging of a ship's bell and the low moan of a foghorn, serving as a strange and dissonant lullaby. She did not know how long she slept. When she awoke, the small room was colder, the candle burned low in its dish. The profound silence was the first thing she noticed. It was not a peaceful silence, but a hollow, empty one. The small, intermittent cries of a newborn were absent. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of her exhaustion. She called out, but there was no answer. She struggled to sit up, her body screaming in protest. The room was empty. The hearth was cold, no swaddled infant resting beside it. Ruthann was gone, and so was her son. When Ruthann finally returned, hours later, as the first gray light of dawn was filtering through the single grimy window pane, her expression was one of practiced sorrow. She told Serafina that the boy had been born with a weakness in his lungs, that despite her best efforts, he had simply stopped breathing. She reported that his passing had been quiet and peaceful. She explained that she had taken the body away, as was her custom, to spare the mother the additional pain of seeing the lifeless form of her child. She spoke of the will of God, of the fragility of life, of the sad reality that so many infants did not survive their first night. But Serafina had seen something in Ruthann's eyes. It was not sympathy. It was a complete and total absence of emotion, a flat, dead calmness that terrified her more than any outburst of anger or grief could have. She also noticed that Ruthann's cloak, which had been damp with the night's mist when she left, was now dry, and it carried a faint, unfamiliar scent beneath the smell of wood smoke and herbs. It was the smell of brine and tar and damp rope, the smell of the docks. Serafina had no proof, no way to challenge the story. She was an enslaved woman. Her word was worth nothing, but she knew. She knew that her son had not died of a weakness in his lungs. She knew that the sound she thought she had heard as she drifted off to sleep, the sound of a carriage moving slowly down the cobbled alley behind her dwelling, had not been a dream. The title she and others had given Ruthann, that of a midwife, a woman of life, was a lie. Ruthann was not a midwife. She was a conduit. She was the first and most terrible link in a chain, the one who took a life from the warmth of its mother's arms and delivered it into the cold, waiting darkness. These individual stories, these private agonies, began to coalesce into a shared and terrifying body of folklore. The rumors grew more specific. They were no longer just vague fears, but a collection of observed details, a mosaic of terror being assembled in secret. Women began to keep watch. An older woman named Temperance, who had seen 3 healthy babies disappear after deliveries attended by Ruthann, became a quiet archivist of the midwife's movements. She noted which ships were in the harbor when Ruthann was called to a berth. She learned to recognize the captains who dealt in illicit cargo, men with cold eyes and reputations for cruelty that were whispered up and down the coast. There was a Captain Obadiah, the master of a fast schooner called the Sea Serpent, who was known to make short, unscheduled runs to the southern ports. It was observed that Ruthann's nighttime activities often coincided with the Sea Serpent's imminent departure. Someone else, a boy who worked the docks cleaning fish, reported seeing Captain Obadiah meeting with a woman in a dark bonnet in the shadow of a warehouse late one night. He could not see her face, but he saw the captain press a small, clinking pouch into her hand before she melted back into the darkness. These testimonies were never spoken of in the open. They were shared in whispers over washboards, in the fleeting moments of shared work in a kitchen, or in the deep of night between trusted friends. They created a secret history, an oral record of Ruthann's crimes that existed entirely outside the official ledgers of the city. The central question that haunted this community was no longer whether she was a healer or not. That question had been answered in the empty cradles and the silent, grieving hearts of too many mothers. The question now was how she could be stopped. She was protected by the very system she served. She was a ghost. Her crimes so perfectly integrated into the tragic rhythms of life and death in the slave quarters that they were almost invisible to the outside world. She was an enabler of the trade, a vital cog in its most hidden machinery, a woman who had turned the sacred space of the birthing room into a loading dock for the ships that sailed on the morning tide, their holds filled with the stolen futures of the newborn. Yet even in the shadows, whispers of resistance grew louder. The suffocating dread that Ruthann Kinsey spread through the waterfront communities did not breed passivity. In the face of a horror that seemed both officially sanctioned and supernaturally cold, the seeds of a quiet, desperate resistance began to sprout. This was not a rebellion of organized marches or fiery speeches. It was a covert war, waged in whispers and shadows, a collection of small, courageous acts of defiance performed by those with the most to lose. The primary battlefield was the female body itself, and the first line of defense was concealment. As the stories of Ruthann's deliveries became a fixed and terrifying part of the local folklore, pregnant women, particularly those nearing their time, began to practice the art of invisibility. They learned to hide their changing bodies beneath layers of loose-fitting clothing, to alter their gait to disguise the telling sway of a woman heavy with child. This was a dangerous, exhausting deception, requiring constant vigilance. Within the confines of a plantation or the crowded tenements, privacy was a non-existent luxury. Every movement was observed, every change in appetite or energy noted by overseers and owners who viewed these women's bodies as productive assets. This conspiracy of concealment was a communal effort, a silent pact made between women who understood the stakes. Others in the community would help, leaving extra portions of food where a pregnant woman could find them without having to ask, taking on heavier tasks to spare her from labor that might reveal her condition. These small acts of solidarity were a lifeline. They created a fragile, hidden network of support, a counter-narrative to the owner's ledger. The goal was to delay the inevitable discovery for as long as possible, to steal a few more weeks, a few more days, before the master was alerted and the countdown to the birth and a potential visit from Ruthann would begin. This act of hiding a pregnancy was a profound reclamation of bodily autonomy. It was a declaration, however silent, that the life growing within was a child, not a commodity, a being to be protected, not an asset to be cataloged. When concealment was no longer possible, a second front of the resistance opened up, the spreading of warnings. Ruthann's name became a code word, a quiet alarm bell. If a woman went into labor, a chain of communication, swift and silent as a summer storm, would be activated. A young boy might be dispatched to run an errand that would conveniently take him past the cabins of other enslaved families. He would use a pre-arranged phrase, perhaps asking for the loan of a tool or inquiring about a lost animal. The words themselves were meaningless. The true message was in the urgency of his voice, the look in his eyes. The news would spread that a birth was imminent, and with it, the implicit warning to be on guard, to watch for the familiar, bonneted figure of the midwife. This network was essential, for it allowed the community to prepare. It bought them precious time. It was a way of saying that one of their own was in peril, and they would not let her face it alone. These warnings were not simply about awareness. They were a call to action. When Ruthann arrived, she would no longer be met by a single, isolated, terrified woman. Instead, she might find the laboring mother surrounded by a silent cadre of other women. Aunts, cousins, trusted friends, all of them present under the guise of offering support. Their presence was a form of passive, powerful resistance. They would sit quietly in the small room, their hands busy with mending or some other small task, but their eyes would be watchful, missing nothing. They became a wall of witnesses. Their collective gaze followed Ruthann's every move, silently challenging her authority, disrupting the isolation she relied upon. She could no longer simply declare a baby had died and expect her word to be the final one. Now, there were other eyes in the room, other ears that had heard the baby's first healthy cry. This silent assembly could not always prevent the tragedy, but it changed the dynamic. It made the lie harder to tell, the theft more difficult to execute. It was a way of asserting a communal claim over the newborn, of saying, "This child belongs to us." Alongside these grassroots efforts, another, more distant form of resistance was beginning to find its voice. The early abolitionist movement, still a fringe and often persecuted cause in the 1820s, was starting to build its case against the institution of slavery, not just on political or economic grounds, but on moral and humanitarian ones. These early activists understood the power of narrative. They began the slow, arduous process of collecting stories, of gathering the testimonies of the enslaved and the formerly enslaved, transforming individual suffering into a collective indictment. They published pamphlets and spoke at small, often clandestine gatherings, their words painting a picture of slavery that directly contradicted the sanitized version preferred by the Southern gentry. They spoke of the lash, of the auction block, of the relentless, soul-crushing labor. And they spoke of the families torn apart, a theme that resonated with a profound and universal horror. It was in these circles that the specific atrocity of infant trafficking began to be exposed. The stories were often fragmented, third-hand accounts that were difficult to verify, but they spoke of a reality that was too monstrous to ignore. They told of women who gave birth one day and were sold away the next, their babies left behind or sold to different masters. They spoke of the fancy trade, where light-skinned children were sold into a life of sexual servitude. And they spoke of the unexplained disappearances of newborns, particularly in the port cities where the domestic slave trade was most active. While Ruthann Kinsey's name may not have appeared in these early abolitionist tracts, her actions were representative of the very evil they sought to expose. They were giving a language to the suffering that women like Seraphina and Temperance had endured in silence. They were creating a moral framework that named these acts for what they were, not the unfortunate but necessary logistics of a labor system, but unforgivable sins against humanity. These abolitionist voices acted as a form of external pressure, a slow-acting acid eating away at the foundations of the slave economy's moral legitimacy. They were a distant echo of the resistance happening on the ground, a formal articulation of the grief and rage that was being expressed in hidden pregnancies and watchful gatherings. For the women clutched their infants in the dark, knowing that the dawn might bring the midwife or the slave trader. The knowledge that someone, somewhere, was speaking out against this horror was a small but vital spark of hope. It was a confirmation that they were not alone in their conviction that this was wrong. The resistance against Ruthann Kinsey and the system she represented was therefore a two-front war. It was fought in the intimate, terrifying space of the birthing room, with silent witnesses and hidden children. And it was fought in the public square, with pamphlets and speeches that sought to awaken the conscience of a nation. The question was whether these disparate acts of courage, these whispers of defiance, could ever be enough to break the grip of a woman who had so perfectly weaponized the act of birth itself. But history has a way of remembering both the villains and the voices who dared to defy them, ensuring that no act of resistance, however small, is ever truly lost. The web of whispers that had for years constituted the only record of Ruthann Kinsey's crimes eventually began to solidify into something more tangible, something that could no longer be dismissed as the fearful folklore of an oppressed community. The tipping point was not a single, dramatic event, but the slow, patient accumulation of evidence, a convergence of disparate accounts that began to point in a single, undeniable direction. The informal archive kept by women like Temperance, a mental ledger of dates, names, and the corresponding departures of slaver ships, grew too substantial to ignore. When a traveling preacher, a man of fierce abolitionist sympathies named Philemon, passed through the city, he found a community ready to speak. In secret, in the dead of night, he listened. He did not seek out the stories, he simply made himself available, a quiet and trusted repository for the grief and outrage that had been suppressed for so long. Philemon was a man who understood the power of the written word. He was not a firebrand orator, but but a meticulous chronicler of suffering. He transcribed the accounts given to him, not in the sanitized, polite language of the formal abolitionist pamphlets, but in the raw, unvarnished words of the women who had lived through the horror. He recorded Serafina's story of her son's impossible death, the scent of the docks on Ruthann's cloak, and the hollow emptiness of the room where her child had last been. He documented Temperance's careful observations, cross-referencing the dates of disappearances with the shipping news he found in old copies of the city's newspapers. He noted the recurring name of Captain Obadiah and his vessel, the Sea Serpent. For the first time, the fragmented pieces of the puzzle were being assembled by a single hand, and the image that emerged was one of a systematic, chillingly efficient operation. Philemon's report was not published in a widely circulated newspaper. It was far too dangerous for that, both for himself and for the people whose stories he carried. Instead, it was circulated as a private document among a small, trusted network of abolitionist organizers. It was read aloud in hushed tones in the back rooms of Quaker meeting houses in Philadelphia and in the studies of sympathetic ministers in Boston. The document, which came to be known simply as the Kinsey testimony, was a bombshell in these private circles. It provided a specific, human face for an atrocity that had previously been understood only in abstract terms. It was no longer a general complaint about the separation of families. It was the story of Ruthann Kinsey, the midwife of the wharves, a woman who had perverted the most sacred of trusts. The name, once a localized whisper of terror, was now inscribed in a document that was being shared among people with the influence and the will to act. The exposure did not lead to a dramatic courtroom trial or a public reckoning. The legal system of the time was not designed to deliver justice for the enslaved. It was designed to protect the property rights of their enslavers. A direct accusation against Ruthann, supported only by the testimony of those she had victimized, would have been dismissed out of hand. The resistance had to be more subtle, more strategic. The abolitionist network began to apply pressure through different channels. They used the information in the Kinsey testimony to bring scrutiny upon the ship captains she worked with. Anonymous letters were sent to port authorities in other cities, tipping them off to the likelihood of illegal human cargo aboard vessels like the Sea Serpent. While these tips rarely resulted in official seizures, they created a climate of increased risk and inconvenience for men like Captain Obadiah. Their illicit activities, once conducted with brazen impunity, now required more care, more bribery, and more risk. The profit margin on their secret cargo began to shrink. Simultaneously, a more direct and localized campaign of social ostracism began against Ruthann herself. The community that had once sought her out in desperation now shunned her completely. When she walked through the streets, conversations would cease, and people would turn their backs. Doors that had once been open to her were now barred. Her trade, which relied on access and a veneer of trust, began to evaporate. Women chose to risk childbirth with only the help of family and friends, rather than summon the woman they now knew to be a predator. Her reputation, once her greatest asset, had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt as something monstrous. She became a pariah, a visible symbol of the community's darkest fears. Her name, once whispered with a mixture of respect and apprehension, was now spoken only as a curse. The precise nature of Ruthann Kinsey's downfall is lost to the imprecise record-keeping of the era, particularly for a woman of her station. There is no official document detailing her arrest or punishment. Her end was likely as shadowy and undocumented as her crimes. One version of the story, passed down through oral tradition, claims that she was eventually forced to flee the city. Her business gone, her name synonymous with evil, she simply disappeared one night, leaving behind her meager possessions. Another, darker rumor suggests that she met a more direct form of justice at the hands of those she had wronged. It was said that a group of men, husbands and brothers of the women whose children she had stolen, confronted her one night on a deserted stretch of the wharf. There was no trial, no judge, no jury. There was only the cold, dark water of the harbor and a final, desperate plea that went unanswered. Whether she fled or was consumed by the very darkness she had served, the result was the same. Ruthann Kinsey vanished from the city, her reign of terror brought to an end not by a formal legal process, but by the collective will of a community that refused to be her victims any longer. Her legacy, however, proved far more enduring than her physical presence. The stories of the babies she delivered to the ships became a permanent part of the region's history, a cautionary tale told to children for generations. She became a figure of folklore, a local bogeyman, a name used to frighten children into obedience. But for historians and chroniclers who would later piece together the fragmented history of the domestic slave trade, her story became something more. It became a case study in the quiet, insidious nature of systemic evil. Her name, preserved in documents like Philemon's testimony and in the margins of abolitionist correspondence, served as a stark reminder of how the grand, abstract crime of slavery was enacted through the small, personal betrayals of individuals. The dusty archives and the scratching pens of historians would ensure that her name was not forgotten, not as a monstrous anomaly, but as a predictable and necessary component of an inhuman economy. The full clarity of her role was now undeniable. She was the woman who delivered infants straight to slave ships, a title that was not an exaggeration or a metaphor, but a literal and horrifying job description. But beyond her individual story, her actions force us to confront something larger, something about the very nature of a society that could create a space for such a profession to exist in the first place. The story of Ruthann Kinsey, in its final accounting, is more than the biography of a single, malevolent woman. It serves as a narrow, focused lens through which we can gaze into a vast and fathomless abyss, the systemic dehumanization that was the engine of American slavery. Her specific cruelty, the theft of a child at the moment of its birth, is a microcosm of the entire institution. It was an institution that predicated its existence on a single, foundational lie, that a human being could be property. And from that lie, all other horrors, both grand and intimate, were made possible. To close the file on her life is to open a larger, more enduring one on the legacy of the children she delivered into the void, a legacy of absence, of broken lineage, and of a trauma so profound that its echoes can still be felt in the quietest corners of the present. The severing of the bond between a mother and her newborn child is a violence that operates outside the normal spectrum of human cruelty. It is not merely a physical act, but a metaphysical one. It is an assault on the future, a theft of the past, and a complete annihilation of the present. For the enslaved mother, this was a grief without a name, a loss without a grave. There was no ritual of mourning, no communal acknowledgement of her pain. Her child, who had existed as a hope and a physical presence within her for 9 months, was transformed in an instant into a ghost, a question mark that would haunt every subsequent moment of her life. Did the child live? Did it cry out for her in the night? Did it survive the perilous journey in the hold of a ship? These were questions without answers, a form of psychological torture that never ended. This unresolved grief becomes a part of the cellular memory, a wound passed down not through blood, but through the stories, the silences, and the enduring sadness of a people. This is the root of generational trauma, a pain so immense that a single lifetime is not long enough to contain it, and so it flows onward, shaping the anxieties and the fears of descendants who may never know its specific source, but who feel its weight all the same. The lost infants of the slave trade are the phantom limbs of 1,000 family trees, an ache for a connection that was brutally amputated at its root. To fully comprehend this, one must be willing to look at the cold, hard artifacts of the system. The ship manifests, the plantation ledgers, the auction notices. These are the documents that reveal the true nature of the ideology at work. In these pages, the language is one of commerce, not cruelty. A human life is reduced to a set of data points: age, height, sex, condition of teeth, skills, and market value. A newborn infant was the ultimate expression of this reduction. It was pure potential property, an entry in an account book listed under increase. The system did not see a child. It saw a future unit of labor, a long-term asset, an investment that, with proper management, would yield a significant return. This transformation of a human being into a commodity is perhaps the most profound violence of all, for it requires the perpetrator to first excise their own humanity. To look upon a newborn, to hear its first cry, and to see not a miracle but a line item on a balance sheet is an act of profound self-mutilation. Ruthann Kinsey was not an anomaly. She was a specialist who had perfected this soulless calculus. She was able to stand in the sacred space of a birth and see only the logistics of a transfer of goods. This mindset was the bedrock of the entire slave economy. It was the necessary delusion that allowed an entire society to participate in and profit from a crime against nature. And so, what does the story of Ruthann Kinsey demand of us today? It demands, first and foremost, the act of remembrance. The ocean that carried those small, stolen bodies is a vast and unmarked grave. The waves that break on the shore today are the same waves that once muffled the cries of infants in the dark, suffocating holds of ships like the sea serpent. To listen to the sound of the ocean is to be reminded of this silent, submerged history. Remembrance, in this context, is not a passive act of acknowledging a distant past. It is an active, moral imperative. It is the work of piecing together the fragmented stories, of speaking the names of the forgotten, of bearing witness to a suffering that was deliberately undocumented. We are the archivists of this pain. By telling stories like this one, we defy the erasure that was central to the system's design. We insist on restoring the humanity that the ledgers and the manifests sought to deny. We declare that these were not units of cargo. They were children, and their lives mattered. This act of remembrance is also a confrontation with our present. The legacy of treating human beings as property did not end with the abolition of slavery. The echoes of this ideology persist in systems that continue to disproportionately marginalize, impoverish, and incarcerate the descendants of the enslaved. The belief that some lives are worth more than others, that some bodies are disposable, is a poison that has yet to be fully purged from the bloodstream of the nation. To look honestly at the story of Ruthann Kinsey is to be forced to look honestly at the world around us, and to ask what systems of dehumanization we still tolerate, what quiet cruelties we allow to persist in the shadows. Her story reminds us that great evil is often not a loud, dramatic explosion, but a quiet, methodical process, a series of small, ordinary transactions that, when added together, create a monstrous sum. And so, from one woman's actions, we are reminded of the immense and terrible weight of history, a weight that we are all, in some way, obligated to carry. The act of looking into this darkness is not meant to paralyze us with guilt, but to arm us with a terrible and necessary clarity. It is a call to empathy, a demand for justice, and a recognition that the past is never truly past. It is a living presence, a whispering ghost that asks only one thing of us: to not look away. The Chronicle of Ruthann Kinsey is now sealed. Your bearing witness to its final entry is a profound act of remembrance. If our journeys into the shadowed archives of the past are a path you wish to continue walking, subscribe to the Blaspheme Archive so you are with us when the next case is brought into the light, and share in the comments what this testimony has left with you.